Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. So we are all the way on to day 12 of the 12 days of quilting from the Open Gate Quilts Advent, and this bag is huge. I'm kind of so sad though that we're already here on the last day because this has been so much fun. We are just flying through December. All right, so let's open this up and see what is inside. Oh my goodness, look how big it is. I'm really excited to see. Look at all this fabric. So Elizabeth, this is a big quilt. It is 57 inches by 74 inches. Oh my goodness, look at it. This is so beautiful. Look at this huge package, and the quilt pattern is just gorgeous. So it's 57 inches by 74 inches, a nice big quilt. Let's look at all of the fabric. And I do want you guys to know that Monique let me know that this pattern is available. So if you didn't get this Advent, but you love the look of this pattern, you can go to the website and purchase the pattern. So I will put a link to that in the description of this video. But let's take a look at all this gorgeous fabric. I'm so excited. I'm also so excited to let you know that I am going to be doing a walkthrough of this quilt. So I will walk you through the different blocks so that you can easily put this quilt together. Isn't that gorgeous? Oh my goodness, this fabric is so pretty. Look at this. Nice cream. This colors that gorgeous border around there. Oh man, this quilt is going to be so beautiful. So the binding. What do you guys think? Oh, this is so, oh my gosh, I cannot believe all of this fabric we have for this amazing pattern. So look at these photos. So we have 1 7/8 yard of main print, 1 yard of blueprint, a 1/2 yard of leaf print fabric, 1 7/8 yard of background fabric, 1/2 yard of binding, 3 3/4 yards of backing, and then we will be using the Fit to Be Geese ruler and the mini Fit to Be Geese ruler. So I will show you how to get these blocks together, and we'll take a look at this pattern. I'm not going to give any of the dimensions, but like I said, if you are interested in this pattern, I will put a link to it in the description of this video so that you can go ahead and grab that. Because look at it, it is so pretty. Oh my goodness, I cannot wait to get started. Ready to construct the Elizabeth pattern. I first starched and ironed all the fabric that I would be using, and I went ahead and got all of the pieces cut. So the first block I'm going to walk you through is the star in a star block. It is absolutely a gorgeous block. I think you're really going to enjoy putting it together. Now, the other block that we will also be making is the chain block. So I will show you that one as well, but let's go ahead and take a look at the star in a star block first. Okay, so here is the star in a star block, and I'm going to walk you through this by first showing you the inner block, and then we will work on the outer block. Now, the block is really constructed of flying geese block. So let's take a look at the inner block and what we will need. So for that inner star, you're going to need the cuts to make the small flying geese, and then you'll need a center block and the small background squares. So when I cut my center blocks, I tried to fussy cut them to get some nice florals and everything in the center. If you notice when you're cutting this floral background that you'll have quite a bit of it left over. So after you cut your setting triangles for the sides of the quilt and the corners, cut those first, and that is how it's cut per the pattern. When you get to these squares, you'll see that you have quite a bit of fabric left over, and so if you want, you can try to fussy cut it as well. So the first thing we'll do with this pattern is make the flying geese. So like I said, you'll need 4 of them for each block. If you like to work 1 block at a time, you can gather 4 of the center triangles for the flying geese, and then you'll need 8 of the blue kind of wings for them. So you'll need 4 for each side. Okay, and then what I like to do, you'll see you have the long diagonal of this side triangle lining up with kind of one of the sides of the center triangle. When you put it right sides together, you're going to have a lot of overhang at the top of the center of the flying geese, and you want the bottom lined up nicely. So this will help ensure that you have enough space at the top of your triangle of the flying geese to have that 1/4 inch, so you're able to keep that nice point on the background of the center triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and sew a 1/4 inch seam along all 4 of one side. Then I'm going to press it, and I'll be able to put on the second side of the triangle. All right, now that I have one side sewn on, I'm going to press all of these seams. Now, the pattern is quite nice in that it does tell you which direction to press all these seams. Make sure you follow them, those pressing instructions, because it will help you later on make sure everything lines up nicely. I am pressing them per the pattern where the seam is laying toward the blue fabric. I find with flying geese, especially since there is a lot of fabric that's going to be meeting up here at this point, that I like to add starch to these seams so that they can lay nice and flat. This one's raised up a bit, so I add some extra starch from this press pin. I did spray all this fabric, but any of them that I see that's raised up a little more, I want that nice and flat. There we go, it got nice and flat now. So now we can add the other triangle on. We're going to work that kind of the same way, just on the opposite side. So I'm going to line up the bottom of the triangle nice and even, having all the overhang of this fabric up at the top. So right sides together, and then I will just be sewing a 1/4 inch seam along there as well. All right, so per the pattern, these are all going to be pressed to that blue fabric as well. And then after I press all of these, I am going to start trimming them. I'm going to use that mini Fit to Be Geese trimmer that we received in the Advent box as well. I'm going to use that to trim these down to size per the pattern. Okay, so to trim the flying geese using the mini Fit to Be Geese, the first thing we're going to do is have the point of that inner triangle facing up. And then when we look at the mini Fit to Be Geese, you'll see you have a triangle here that is printed in black. You want that point in the triangle to line up perfectly with your seams. So those blue seams are going to be lined up perfectly with the black triangle. And you'll see here that the top of the mini Fit to Be Geese is lined up such that we'll have a perfect 1/4 inch seam left at the top, or 1/4 inch overhang, so that'll help us keep that point nice and even when we're sewing. So I cut off the top of the flying geese, and you see that we have that 1/4 inch left to keep that point. So I'm going to flip it upside down now, and I'm going to line up that center line with the point of the triangle that's now facing me, and I'm going to line up the bottom of the triangle evenly, and that is the line that for the measurement that I want this flying geese to be. So if you want a smaller flying geese, you would be lining up with a different line on here. So once I get that lined up, the bottom line of the triangle with my fabric that was trimmed before, I'm going to trim the top now. So it wasn't as much fabric, but now we have 2 straight lines. So now I'm going to turn the flying geese side or up and down, so it's going lengthwise now. And we're going to be using the red lines now on this mini Fit to Be geese. So I'm going to be using the lines that are the farthest out. And what I'm going to be doing is lining up the center line on here with the point, because that will let me know that I have it lined up even. I'm going to trim off the top, and then I'm going to turn the flying geese, and now I can line up the bottom of the ruler with the freshly trimmed edge, and I can make sure that the red lines on either side are lined up so that I know I'm not crooked, and trim the top. So now we have a perfect little flying geese, and I will do that with all 3 of the rest of them. Now, if you like to work all the steps at one time, that's often what I like to do as well. I could go ahead and get all of these flying geese ready. We're going to be making 12 blocks total of this star and a star block. So you could get all the flying geese ready at once and do all your sewing, pressing, and trimming of these, and then just be able to put all of the inner blocks together at once. That's probably how I will work this, but I do want to just show you getting one of these blocks finished for now, and then I'll do all the others that way. So I'm going to get all these trimmed, and I'll show you how to bring together the inner star block. All right, so now that all 4 flying geese are trimmed, we're going to lay them out along with one of the center blocks, and we are going to lay out the 4 flying geese such that the blue is going to be facing in toward the center block to make that star, and then we are going to take 4 of the background small squares to put in those 4 corners. We're going to first strip sew this center star together. So we're going to sew the white backgrounds on the outside of the first top row with the star points. Then in the middle, we're going to sew the 2 flying geese to the side of the center block. And then with the bottom row, we're going to sew the 2 background squares onto the side of the flying geese. So let's get this sewn, and then we'll take a look at pressing for it. All right, so for pressing this block, again, we're going to follow the instructions that are in the pattern, and we are going to press the seams on the star points with the background squares. We're going to press those seams out toward the little squares. So they're going to be pressed out. And then for the center block, the seams are going to be pressed into the center block. So I'm going to get these pressed, and then I'll show you how to bring this inner star together. All right, so if you follow the pressing, then these strips are going to come together really nicely and nest really well. So you can see our seams are pressed in opposite directions. So the seams, you'll be able to feel it be nice and flat there because the fabric is turned in opposite directions. So I like to put a pin right at those seams, kind of on the diagonal, so the top of the pin goes through one side of the seam and the bottom goes through the other, so that it holds them nice in place when I go over to sew. Because there's enough space here, I like to go ahead and add the bottom row of the star on, get it all lined up and put pins in so I can just sew them while I'm over at the sewing machine as well. So let's go sew these 2 seams, And then we are going to press these as well. Now we're going to press the seams away from the center block. So I'll show you that. All right, so there is our center block, and you can see since we used that trimmer and left that little bit of a 1/4 of an inch, we have some pretty nice points through here. Now, what we need to do next is make larger flying geese. So we need 4 of these larger flying geese. They're going to be constructed just like the smaller ones. So I have one already made. So I'm going to grab 3 more of the blue fabric triangles, and then I'm going to get the side triangles. So normally, since I already have one made, you would have 4 of these blue ones to create 1 flying geese, and then 4 of the background triangles for each side, but we just need 3 since I'm only needing to make 3 more. Now we're going to sew these just as before with the smaller ones. We're going to sew all of the background side triangles, right sides together with the center, line up the bottom of the triangles, and you're going to have that overhang at the top. I'm going to sew the sides onto all of them, and then we are going to press these triangles seams to the side again. So even though this isn't the darker fabric, we're still going to press the fabric out toward it. And then we will put on the other side of the triangle and trim. All right, so the seams are all pressed to the outside. And now I'm going to put the triangle, background triangle on the other side. And remember that overhang, we want it up at the top. So line up at the bottom, overhang at the top, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. We will press the seam to the background fabric, the side triangle again, and then we will trim. All right, so these are all pressed, and now we're going to trim. All right, so I have one of the large flying geese here, and the Fit to be Geese ruler works just as the mini. We're going to first line up the dark black lines, the triangle, with the seams. Make sure we have that 1/4 inch at the top. Make sure that it's nice and as even as you can get. And then just trim across the top. Then we're going to flip the flying geese around, and you want to line up the line at the bottom of the triangle with the freshly cut line that we just made. And we want to line up the line for the measurement of the flying geese we are making. And then we will trim along the top again. When I'm trimming along the top, I usually don't have as much fabric left over as I do on the first cut. Then we're going to turn the flying geese to the side. And on this ruler, I find it a little bit easier because I can see the red dashed X a little bit better here to make sure it's lined up at the point. And then I'm going to line up the red dash lines for the size flying geese I am making along those 2 freshly cut top and bottom of the flying geese. Once it's nice and straight and I see that X is at the point, I'm going to trim the top. And then turn the flying geese, and this side is the easiest to cut because we can make sure the bottom of the ruler's lined up, or the line for the size flying geese that you are making is lined up. Once all these 2 side lines and the bottom are nice and lined up, then you can trim the top of the flying geese. So I'm going to get the last 2 flying geese trimmed up, and then we'll finish up the star block. All right, so now that my flying geese are trimmed, I'm going to grab the other pieces that we'll need to bring this block together. We're going to need that first center star that we just constructed using the mini flying geese. We're going to need our 4 large flying geese, and this time we are going to turn the dark blue so it is facing out. So that long bottom end of the dark blue is facing out, and the background fabric is going to be forming these stars on the inside now. All right, and then we just need 4 more pieces. So I'm going to grab these larger blue squares that we cut, and they are going to go in the corners. So you can kind of decide which way you would like your lines on these to face. I'm going to have them follow the top and bottom lines, so they're going to, for me, face horizontal. I know that these outer ones are going up and down, but for me, I like the way it looks. You don't have to pay attention to those little lines at all. They're barely noticeable, but I'm just pointing it out for me. So to sew these together, we're going to do just as before. I'm going to sew one of the corner squares along each side of the flying geese. These center flying geese are going to be sewn right sides together onto that center block, and then the same with the bottom row. The two corner squares are going to be sewed onto the side of the flying geese. So I'm going to get that done. All right, so now that the strips are sewn, I have the top and bottom strips pressed to where the seams are pressed out toward the squares. And then for the center strip, the seams are pressed into the center small star block. So now, just as before, these seams should nest really nicely. So I'm just going to bring them together and feel where they line up and place some pins in. And I'm going to go ahead and pin the top and the bottom row and sew them. And then we will press these seams per the instructions. They are going to be pressed out toward the smaller strips. So I will show you the final block and that pressing after I get these seams sewn. All right, so here is the final block. Isn't it gorgeous? I love these colors together. And like I said, if you're able to fussy cut some of these squares, they look so cute with the flowers prominent in the center. Making sure you use those trimmers is key. You can get these points really nice, getting that perfect 1/4 inch seam at the top of the flying geese blocks. So I pressed the final seams out toward these smaller strips on the top and the bottom, and that will help all these blocks come together in the end. So next we'll be working on the chain block. So let me know what you thought so far of the star block. I think it is a gorgeous block. I would love a quilt with just this block, I think. All right, so let's take a look at the chain block now. All right, so now that we have finished the 6 star blocks we need, and I love this block so much. So after we finish these 6 star blocks, we're going to be working on 12 chain blocks. But I am telling you, this block looks great as well. And it is also surprisingly going to be very, very easy to put together. I love the way that Monique has us piece this block. So the first step that you're going to do is take your center block, and it was with that lovely striped light blue fabric. It's just a square, and then you're going to take your smaller background rectangles, and we're going to be sewing those smaller background rectangles onto 2 sides of the center block. So we're going to take one, put it right sides together, sew a 1/4 inch seam, take the other, put it right sides together, and sew a 1/4 inch seam. It is going to come together really beautifully. And I'm just going to chain piece these. So I'm going to put one side on all of the squares and then go to the other side and put one side on. It'll make this step go really fast. Now, let's talk about pressing it. Once we get the rectangle on each side, we are going to press the seam to the center of the block on both sides. All right, so let's get sewing. All right, so after you get the rectangles sewn onto each side of your center square, you can get all those seams pressed to the center. So I have 12 of these done, so we're going to move on to the next step. And for this step, you are going to need your blue leaf fabric that you already have cut to size. And your background fabric, you're going to need the strips that you cut that are thinner. So if you got all of your cutting done, you do have some wide background strips, but we're going to use those in the last step. With these long rectangles that you have of background fabric, you're going to find the matching strips that you have. You'll need 2 of them. So you can see I have 2 leaf fabrics that are the same length as this background strip. And we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along each length. So we're going to put a leaf fabric along each side of this background strip. So sew a 1/4 inch seam with them right sides together. And we're going to press the seams out to the leaf. Okay, so we're going to have this strip, and then we have another strip that is longer and 2 longer strips of the leaves. And we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side. So this leaf fabric is going to be the length of this strip. All right, so now that both of my strip sets are sewn, I am going to square up one side and I'm going to cut my strip sets. So I am lining up the edge along one of my lines on my cutting mat, and then I'm just going to trim one side so that I have a nice straight line to work with. All right, so now that it is trimmed, I'm going to make sure everything is straight again, and I'm just going to cut my strips. We're going to cut 24 strips here, and your pattern will let you know what the width of your strips needs to be. So again, we're going to cut 24. All right, and then once we get all of the strips cut, we are going to sew them along the sides of that center block, just like that, right sides together. If you did all the pressing correct, your seams will nest together nicely again. Once you have them nice and nested together, put a pin right along that seam. I'm going to get both sides ready. And then once they're nice and lined up, you see that, where they're just meeting together really perfectly, we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side. We will be pressing these in towards the center block, so I will show you that. All right, so now that all of my first steps of the block is finished for the chain block, I have all of the seams pressed into the center square. Now what we're going to be doing is sewing the larger rectangles onto each side of the block. So we'll sew a 1/4 inch seam and we'll press that seam out. After we get that step finished, just as before, we are going to sew our leaf print strips to each side of the larger background strip. So we'll have the same amount of strips as before. We are going to cut 24 strips from these. Once we cut those strips, we'll be sewing them along the outside of the block and pressing out, and this block will be finished. So remember, we're sewing 12 of these. All right, so I have the side rectangles sewn on to all of the blocks, and I have them pressed out to the background strip. So there are 12 of these ready to go, and then I have my final strip set ready. So I have the floral blue fabric strips sewn to the outside of the background rectangle, and now we're just going to cut our strips. So just as before, I have this strip set lined up on a line on my mat, and I'm going to cut a nice straight line across here to get it nice and even, and then I'm going to cut 24 strips to size per the pattern. So I'm going to cut all these. And then I'm going to do the same thing as before. This block is so easy because you're really repeating some of the same steps. So you'll be able to figure out how to bring this together very easily. Now, I don't think I showed, but on those strip sets, we are pressing the seams in toward the background fabric, and that'll again allow these to nest nicely. So let me show you. You're gonna have one strip on the top and one on the bottom. And we'll flip them right sides together and pin along the seam. I'll probably put a few other pins in just to keep it nice and even. Probably one at each of the seams. Since you can nest them, you can feel them come together nicely. And then I'll probably put a pin in the middle as well, just to hold this all together and make sure it stays lined up. And then I'll go ahead and pin the other side for sewing as well. So then I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side, and then we will be pressing the seams up toward this small strip. Okay, and just like that, all 12 of my chain blocks and 6 of my star and the star blocks are all finished. So now what I'm going to do is lay everything out on my design board so that I can make sure I have the layout absolutely correct. I will be also using the setting triangles and the corner triangles to lay out, and I will be finishing up the quilt with the border. So I'm going to lay everything out and just sew the rows together on the diagonal. There is a great layout in the pattern to show how to do that, so I'm going to follow that layout and sewing the rows together and bring the quilt all the way together. I cannot wait to see how it looks because these colors are gorgeous together. All right, so as we piece this, I'm going to give you a few tips on lining everything up, because you can see here that the triangle goes past the edge of your block. So to help make sure you have it lined up right, you can fold your corner triangle in half and press, and fold your block in half and press. And you can press up with your iron too if it helps to be able to see it a little better. When you open it up, you have those creases and you line them up, and then you know that your corner of your triangle will be perfectly lined up with your row of blocks so that it's not crooked or anything like that. So I'm going to put a few more pins in and sew across, and then I'll just continue sewing my row together and then bring all the rows together to complete the quilt. But hopefully this helped you. Now, when I get to sewing an end of a row and I have a setting triangle that I need to attach, what I'm going to do is line up that 90-degree angle with the block and put some pins in along there and just let the end of the setting triangle hang off of the end of the block. This is okay that it does this because later before we put the border on and we have all of the top pieced except for the border, we're going to trim a 1/4 inch away from the points of the triangle to make sure everything lines up nice and even. All right, so now that all of the rows are sewn together on my quilt top, we just have the border strips to add on. However, there is a very, very important step here, and I'm going to give you a few tips on how to complete this step. So we have these beautiful setting triangles through here, but you do see that they can be kind of uneven, so we do want to trim this up before we add the borders on. Now, this is a good time to use one of your nice long rulers. And I love that this ruler has a lot of different lines on it that can help me keep everything lined up. Now, not all rulers have all the lines, but they definitely are helpful, and sometimes I forget to utilize them. So I'm going to take this 45-degree angle, and it's going to help me make sure I'm keeping everything straight on this side of the quilt when I go to cut. And then I also have a dash line here that is my 1/4 inch line. This is going to help me because I want to stay a 1/4 inch away from my squares here. So this last square in the block. So doing that will make sure when I put my border strips on that I keep this nice straight point here on that square. So I'm going to line up that 45-degree angle on the side of my setting triangle, and I'm going to keep that 45 or that 1/4 inch line right lined up with the point as well. So hopefully you can see that there. And now I just need to turn this edge down here to make sure that the 1/4 inch line is lined up with the point down here on this block as well. So once I get that all lined up, which can take a bit of time, but it's really important to do because that makes sure that you're squaring up your quilt nice and even. So I got it all lined up, and then I'm just going to cut. And hopefully not shift my ruler too much before I go to cut. So I have that first cut there, and then I'll just move the quilt along and keep doing that at each setting triangle all the way around the quilt. And once I get it all trimmed up, I can start adding the border strips on. Now keep in mind that it is really important to measure your quilt as you add your border strips on. I like to start with the long sides of my quilt, so I will measure the length of the quilt and then piece my border strips together and measure them to that length that I have. Now, hopefully the length of my quilt is the same as the quilt, but we all know we have different seam allowances that we end up with, and it could be a little bit different. So be sure to measure. So after I get my side borders on, then I'll add the top and bottom. And when I go to add those on, I will measure as well and then piece my strips together to get that length if I need to. All right, and then after you get the borders on, your quilt top is finished. It turns out so gorgeous. I absolutely love this pattern, and the fabric is perfect for it. I really enjoyed putting it together. It was so nice that it was only 2 quilt blocks that make up the whole quilt. It made it really, really easy to piece. Once you learn how each block goes together, it was just a breeze putting it together. I also loved using those templates from Monique. I love that she included them in the box, and then we got to use them for the pattern. So if you are interested in the Elizabeth pattern or those amazing templates, even if you aren't using them on this pattern, they'll come in so handy for any pattern that you're using Flying Geese in. So the pattern is available on her website. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video, and the templates are available on her website as well, so I will include those links in the description as well. Be sure to let Monique know if you want to get on her email list to be notified when this Advent is available again next year. There is a lot of interest, so you'll want to make sure you are one of the first to hear about it being available again. You can also check out her monthly subscription boxes. They are just as amazing as this Advent has been. All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this 12 Days of Quilting Advent from the Open Gate Quilt Shop. Bye.